Happy Wednesday, everybody. I hope everyone is staying safe and sane out there. It's been a crazy year, and it just keeps getting crazier. I don't know if anyone's following continued prayers for Lebanon. I'll add a link in the description. Impact Lebanon is an organization that works doing different social work in Lebanon, and they're raising funds to help support the Lebanese Red Cross at this time. So if you haven't heard about the explosion in Beirut, there has been significant loss of life and injury, and many, I'm guessing like upwards over 300,000 people may be homeless because of it. But yeah, if you want to, it'd be great for people to donate and help support relief efforts there. It's crazy. And on that happy note, we are in Volume 3 now, starting Part 3 of Volume 3 today in War and Peace. And like I said yesterday, I'm really hoping that if we maybe push the readings a little bit longer each day, just really, we might be able to get the last third of this book done maybe in the next month. I know that's ambitious, but sue me. So yeah. And we ended the last part with the end of the Battle of Borodino. And let's see where we pick up today. So Volume 3, Part 3, Section 1. For human reason, absolute continuity of movement is incomprehensible. Man begins to understand the laws of any kind of movement only when he examines the arbitrary chosen units of that movement. But at the same time, it is from this arbitrary division of continuous movement into discrete units that the greater part of human error proceeds. A well-known so-called sophism of the ancients posits that Achilles can never overtake a tortoise that is walking ahead of him, even though Achilles walks 10 times faster than the tortoise. While Achilles covers the distance that separates him from the tortoise will get ahead of him by 1/10 of that distance. Achilles covering that 1/10, the tortoise gets ahead by 1/100th, and so on to infinity. The ancients considered this problem insolvable. The nonsensical conclusion that Achilles will never overtake the tortoise resulted only from the fact that discrete units of movement were introduced arbitrarily, while the movement of both Achilles and the tortoise was continuous. By taking smaller and smaller units of measurement, we only approach the solution of the problem but never reach it. Only by allowing for an infinitesimal quantity and the ascending progression from that up to 1/10, and by taking the sum of that geometrical progression, we do arrive at the solution of the problem. A new branch of mathematics, having attained to the art of dealing with infinitesimal quantities in order, more complex problems of movement as well, now gives answers to questions that used to seem insoluble. This new branch of mathematics, unknown to the ancients, in examining questions of movement, allows for infinitesimal quantities, that is, such as restore the main condition of movement, absolute continuity, and thereby corrects the inevitable error of human reason cannot help committing when it examines discrete units of movement instead of continuous movement. The same thing happened in the search for the laws of historical movement. The movement of mankind, proceeding from countless number of human wills, occurs continuously. To comprehend the law of this movement is the goal of history. But in order to comprehend the law of the continuous movement of the sum of all individual wills, human reason allows for arbitrary, discrete units. The first method, history consists in taking an arbitrary series of continuous events and examining it separately from others, whereas there is not and cannot be a beginning to any event. But one event always continuously follows another. The second method consists in examining the actions of one person, a king, a commander, as the sum of individual wills, whereas the sum of the individual wills is never expressed in the activity of one historical person. Historical science, in its movement, always takes even smaller units for examination, and in this way strives to approach the truth. But however small the units that history takes, we feel that allowing for a unit that is separate from another, allowing for the beginning of some phenomena, and allowing for the notion that all individual wills are expressed in the actions of one historical person, is false in itself. Any conclusion of historical science, however, without the least effort on the part of criticism, falls apart like dust, leaving nothing behind, only as a result of the fact that the criticism selects as an object for observation a larger or smaller discrete unit, which it always has the right to do, because any chosen historical unit is always arbitrary. Only by admitting an infinitesimal unit for observation, a differential of history, that is, the uniform striving of people, and attaining to the art of integrating them, taking the sums of these infinitesimal quantities, can we hope to comprehend the laws of history. Only by admitting an infinitesimal unit for observation, a differential of history, that is, the uniform striving of people, and attaining to the art of integrating them, taking the sum of the infinitesimal quantities, can we hope to comprehend the laws of history. And I thought the Russian, French, Latin, and German was tough. The first 15 years of the 19th century in Europe present an extraordinary movement of millions of people. People abandon their usual occupation, rush from one side of Europe to the other, plunder, kill each other, triumph and despair, and the whole course of life is altered for several years and presents an intense movement, which initially increases and then weakens. Human reason asks, what was the cause of this movement? Or, according to what laws did it occur? Historians, in answer to this question, lay before us the deeds and speeches of several dozen men in one of the buildings in the city of Paris, calling these deeds and speeches by the name Revolution. Then they give a detailed biography of Napoleon and of some persons sympathetic or hostile to him, tell of the influence of some of these persons on others, and say, here is the origin of this movement, here are its laws. But human reason not only refuses to believe in this explanation, but says straight out that this method of explanation is incorrect. Because in this explanation, a weaker phenomena is taken as the cause of a stronger one. The sum of individual human wills produced the Revolution and Napoleon, and only the sum of those wills endured them and then destroyed them. But every time there were conquests, there were conquerors. Every time there were upheavals in state, there were great men, says history. Indeed, each time conquerors appeared, there were wars. Human reason replies, but that does not prove that the conquerors were the cause of the wars, and that it is possible to find the laws of war in the personal activity of one man. Every time I look at my watch and see the hand approaching 10, I hear the bells start to ring in the neighboring church. Yet from the fact that the bells start to ring every time the hand reaches 10, I have no right to conclude that the position of the hand is the cause of the movement of the bells. Every time I see the movement of a locomotive, I hear a whistling sound. I see the opening of the valve and the movement of the wheels, but I have no right to conclude from this that the whistling and the movement of the wheels are the cause of the movement of the locomotive. Peasants say a cold wind blows in late spring because the leaf buds of the oak tree are sprouting, and indeed a cold wind blows every spring when the oak is sprouting. But though the cause of the cold wind that blows as the oak sprouts is unknown to me, I cannot agree with the peasants about the sprouting of the oak being the cause of the cold wind, if only because the force of the wind is beyond the influence of the leaf buds. I only see the coincidence of the conditions that occur in every phenomenon in life. And I see that, however long and thoroughly I observe the hand of my watch and the valve and the wheels of the locomotive and the leaf buds, I will not learn the cause of the bells ringing, the movement of the train, and the spring wind. For that I must change my point of observation completely, and study the law of the movements of stems, bells, and the wind. Of steam, bells, and the wind. Historical science must do the same, and attempts at it have already been made. To study the laws of history, we must Change completely the object of observation, leave kings, ministers, and generals alone, and study the uniform, infinitesimal elements that govern the masses. No one can tell to what extent it is given to man to achieve in this way an understanding of the laws of history. But it is obvious that the possibility of grasping historical laws lies only on this path, and that on this path human reason has not yet made 1/1,000,000th of those efforts that the historians have made in describing the deeds of various kings, commanders, and ministers, and in setting forth their reflections on the occasion of those deeds. Section 2. The forces of 2 and 10 European nations burst into Russia. The Russian army and the populace retreat, avoiding a confrontation as far as Smolensk, and from Smolensk to Borodino. The French army, with an ever-increasing force of momentum, races on to Moscow, the goal of its movement. The forces of its momentum increase as it nears its goal, just as the velocity of a falling body increases as it nears the earth. Behind are thousands of miles of famished, hostile country, ahead are a few dozen miles separating it from its goal. Every soldier of Napoleon's army feels that, and the invasion pushes on of itself by the mere force of its momentum. In the Russian army, as it retreats, the spirit of hostility towards the enemy flares up more and more. As it falls back, it concentrates and increases. At Borodino, a confrontation takes place. Neither army falls apart, but immediately after the confrontation, the Russian army retreats of necessity, just as a ball rebounds of necessity after colliding with another ball coming towards it at a greater speed. And also of necessity, although losing all its force in the collision, the swiftly rolling ball of the invasion rolls on for a certain distance. The Russian retreat another 80 miles beyond Moscow. The French reach Moscow and stop there. During the 5 weeks after that, there is not a single battle. The French do not move. Like a mortally wounded beast, which losing blood licks its wounds, they remain in Moscow for 5 weeks without undertaking anything, and suddenly, with no cause, flee back. They rush down the Kaluga high road, and that after a victory, for the field remains theirs again after Yaroslavets. Without entering a single serious battle, flee still more quickly back to Smolensk, beyond the Vilno, beyond Berezina, and further. On the evening of the 26th of August, both Kutuzov and the whole Russian army were convinced that the Battle of Borodino had been won. Kutuzov wrote as much to the sovereign. Kutuzov ordered preparations for a new battle to finish off the enemy, not because he wanted to deceive anyone, but because he knew the enemy was defeated, just as every participant in the battle knew it. But the same evening and the next day, reports came in one after another about unheard of losses, about the loss of half the army, and a new battle turned out to be physically impossible. It was impossible to offer battle when not all the information had been gathered, when the wounded had not been taken away, the charges had not been replenished, the dead had not been counted, new commanders had not been appointed to replace those killed, and the men had not had enough food or sleep. And at the same time, immediately after the battle, the next morning, the French army, by that impetuous force of movement, now increased in inverse proportion to the square of distance, was of itself already making for the Russian army. Kutuzov had wanted to attack the next day, and the whole army had wanted it. But in order to attack, the wish to do so is not enough. What is needed is the possibility of doing so, and the possibility was not there. It was impossible not to retreat by one march. Then it was just as impossible not to retreat by another, and by a third. And finally, on the 1st of September, when the army got as far as Moscow, despite the strength of feeling that arose in the ranks of the army, the force of things demanded that those troops go beyond Moscow, and the troops retreated one last march and surrendered Moscow to the enemy. For those who are accustomed to think that the plans of war and battle are drawn up by commanders, just as each of us, sitting in his study over a map, makes reflections on how he would have disposed of such and such battles, questions present themselves as to why Kutuzov, as he retreated, did not act thus and so, why he did not take up a position before Fili, why he did not retreat directly to the Kaluga road, why did he abandon Moscow, and so on. People who are accustomed to think that way forget or do not know those inevitable conditions in which the activity of every commander-in-chief always takes place. The activity of a commander does not have the slightest resemblance to the activity we imagine to ourselves, sitting at ease in our study, analyzing some campaign on a map with uh, a known number of troops on one side and the other, and on known terrain, beginning our reflections from some certain moment. A commander-in-chief is never in those conditions of the beginning of some event in which we are always consider events. A commander-in-chief always finds himself in the middle of a shifting series of events in such a way that he is never able at any moment to ponder all the meaning of the ongoing events. Imperceptibly, moment by moment, an event is carved into its meaning. And at every moment of this consistent, ceaseless carving of the event, a commander-in-chief finds himself in the center of the most complex play of intrigues, cares, dependency, power, projects, advice, threats, deceptions, finds himself constantly in necessity of responding to a countless number of questions put to him, which will always contradict each other. Learned military men tell us quite seriously that Kutuzov ought to have moved his troops to the Kaluga road long before Fili, that someone had even suggested such a plan. But a commander-in-chief, especially at a difficult moment, has before him not one plan, but always dozens simultaneously, and all these plans, based on strategy and tactics, contradict each other. The work of the commander-in-chief seems to be merely to choose one of these plans, but he cannot do that. Events and time do not wait. Suppose the suggestion is made to move to the Kaluga road on the 28th, but just then an adjutant comes galloping from Miloradovich and asks whether or not they should go into action against the French now or retreat. An order must be given at once, that minute, and the order to retreat deflects us from the turnoff to the Kaluga road. After the adjutant, a commissary comes asking where to transport the food supplies, and the head of the hospital asking where to transport the wounded, and a courier from Petersburg brings a letter from the sovereign that does not admit the possibility of abandoning Moscow, and the commander's rival, the one who tries to undermine him, there are always rivals, not one, but several, suggests a new plan, diametrically opposed to the plan of going to the Kaluga road, and the commander's own forces require sleep and fortification, and a venerable general, overlooked for a reward, comes to complain, and the inhabitants beg for protection, and an officer sent to survey the terrain comes and reports the complete opposite of what an officer sent out before him had said, and a spy, a prisoner, and a general who did some reconnoitering all describe the position of the enemy army differently. People accustomed to not understanding or forgetting all these unavoidable conditions of the activity of any commander-in-chief present to us, for instance, the position of the army at Fili, and in so doing suppose that the 1st of September the commander-in-chief could quite freely decide the question of whether to abandon or defend Moscow, whereas with the Russian army position within 3 miles of Moscow, this question could not exist. When, then, was the question decided? At Drissa and at Smolensk, and most palpably at Shevardino on the 24th, and on the 26th at Borodino, and every hour, day, minute of our retreat from Borodino to Fili. Section 3. The Russian troops, having retreated from Borodino, were camped at Fili. Ermolov, who had gone to survey the position, rode up to the field marshal. "It is not possible to fight in this position," he said. Kutuzov looked at him in surprise and made him repeat what he said. When he did, Kutuzov held out his hand to him. "Give me your hand," he said, turning it so as to feel the pulse. He said, "You are unwell, my dear boy. Think about what you're saying." On Poklonnaya Hill, 4 miles from the Dorgomilovo gate, Kutuzov got out of his carriage and sat down on a bench by the side of the road. A huge crowd of generals gathered around him. Count Rostopchin, having come from Moscow, joined him. All this brilliant society, breaking up into several circles, talked amongst themselves about the advantages and disadvantages of the position of Moscow, about military suggestions in general. Everyone felt that, though they had not been summoned for that, though it had not been called for, that it was a council of war. All conversations kept to the area of general questions. If anyone reported or asked about personal news, he spoke of it in a whisper, and at once went on to general questions again. No jokes, no laughter, no smiles even, could be noticed among all the people. Everyone, with obvious effort, tried to be equal to the occasion. All the groups, talking among themselves, tried to keep in proximity to the commander-in-chief, whose bench constituted the center of these circles, and spoke so that he was able to hear them. The commander-in-chief listened and occasionally asked them to repeat what had been said around him, but did not enter the conversation himself or express any opinion. Most often, having listened to the conversation in some circle, he turned away with a look of disappointment, as if what they were speaking about was not at all what he wished to hear. One spoke of the position chosen, criticizing not so much the position as the mental abilities of those who had chosen it. Another argued that the mistake had been made before, that battle should have been accepted 2 days earlier. A third discussed the battle of Salamanca, which the newly arrived Frenchman Croissart in a Spanish uniform told about. This Frenchman, along with one of the German princes who served in the Russian army, was analyzing the siege of Saragossa, anticipating the possibility of defending Moscow in the same way. In a fourth circle, Count Rostopchin said that he and the Moscow militia were ready to perish under the walls of the capital, but even so he could not help regretting the uncertainty in which he had been left, and had he known it earlier, things would have been different. A fifth, showing the profundity of its strategic reflections, spoke of the direction the troops would have to take. A sixth talked total nonsense. Kutuzov's face was growing more and more preoccupied and sad. From all these conversations, Kutuzov saw one thing. The defense of Moscow was, in no way, physically possible. In the full meaning of those words, that is, impossible to such a degree that if some insane commander-in-chief gave the order to offer battle, confusion would set in, and there would be no battle anyway. There would not be, because all the higher officers not only acknowledged that the position was impossible, but in their conversations discussed only what would take place after the undoubted abandoning of that position. How could the officers lead their troops to a battle they considered impossible? The lower officers, even the soldiers, who also reasoned, considered the position just as impossible, and therefore could not go to fight in the certainty of defeat. If Bennigsen insisted on the defense of that position, and others still discussed it, the question no longer had any meaning in itself, but only as a pretext for arguing and intrigue. Kutuzov understood that. Bennigsen, having chosen this position, ardently displayed his patriotism, which Kutuzov could not listen to without wincing, insisted on defending Moscow. Kutuzov saw Bennigsen's aim as clear as day. If the defense failed, to throw the blame on Kutuzov, who had let the troops as far as Sparrow Hills without a battle. If it succeeded, to ascribe it to himself. In case of refusal, to clear himself of criminally abandoning Moscow. But this question of intrigue did not concern the old man now. One terrible question concerned him, and he heard no answer to this question from anyone. For him, the question now consisted only in this: can it be that I allowed Napoleon to get as far as Moscow? And when, then, did I do it? When was it decided? Was it yesterday, when I sent Platov the order to retreat? Or was it in the evening before, when I dozed off and told Bennigsen to give the orders? Or still earlier? But when? When was this terrible matter decided? Moscow must be abandoned. The troops must retreat, and the order has to be given. To give this terrible order seemed to him the same as giving up command of the army, and it was not just that he loved power and was used to it. The honors given to the Prince Prozorovsky, to whom he had been attached in Turkey, piqued him. But he was convinced that he was destined to save Russia, and only because of that, against the will of the sovereign and by the will of the people, was he chosen commander-in-chief. He was convinced that he alone, in those difficult circumstances, could maintain himself as the head of the army, and that he alone in the whole world was capable of knowing without dread that his adversary was the invincible Napoleon. And he dreaded the thought of the order he had to give. But he had to decide something, had to choose these conversations around him, had to stop these conversations around him, which were beginning to take on too free a character. He called the senior generals to him. Ma tête, fut-elle bon ou mauvaise, n'a que céder d'elle-même. My heart, be it good or bad, can only help itself, he said, getting up from the bench and riding to Filly, where his carriages were waiting. Section 4. In the spacious better side of the Muzhik, Andrei Savotsayanov's cottage, a council gathered at 2 o'clock. The men, women, and children of the large peasant family crowded into the kitchen side, across the front hall. Only Andrei's granddaughter, Malasha, a 6-year-old girl whom his serenity caressed and gave a lump of sugar at tea, stayed on the stove in the big side. Malasha looked down timidly and joyfully from the stove on the faces, uniforms, and crosses of the generals who came into the cottage one after another and sat down in the best corner on wide benches under the icons. Grandpa himself, as Malasha mentally called Kutuzov, sat apart from them in a dark corner behind the stove. He sat deeply immersed in a folding armchair, constantly groaning and spreading the collar of his tunic, which, though unbuttoned, still seemed to chafe his neck. The entering men went up to the field marshal one after another. He shook hands with them, nodded to others. The adjutant, Kaysarov, was about to pull open the curtain on the window opposite Kutuzov, but Kutuzov waved his hand crossly, and Kaysarov understood that his serenity did not want people to see his face. There were so many people gathered around the peasant pine table, on which lay maps, plans, pencils, and papers, that the orderlies brought another bench and sat it down at the table. On this bench sat the already arrived Ermolov, Kaysarov, and Toll. Just under the icons in the foremost place, a St. George on his neck, with a pale, sickly face, and with his high forehead merging with his bald head, sat Barclay de Tolly. It was the second day that he had been suffering from a fever, and just then he had chills and cramps. Next to him sat Uvarov, who, in a low voice, as they all spoke, was telling Barclay something, gesticulating rapidly. The small, round Doktorov, with raised eyebrows, listened attentively, his hands folded on his stomach. On the other side, his broad head, with his bold features and shining eyes, propped on his hand, sat Count Osterman Tolstoy, who seemed to be immersed in his own thoughts. Raevsky, with an impatient expression, twirled the black hair of his temples with a habitual gesture, glancing now at Kutuzov, now at the door. The firm, handsome, and kindly face of Konovnitsyn shone with a tender and sly smile. He met Malasha's gaze and made signs to her with his eyes that made the girl smile. They were all waiting for Benigsen, who, on the pretext of making a new survey of the position, was finishing his delicious dinner. They waited for him from 4 to 6 o'clock, and all that while did not commence deliberations, but conducted conversations in quiet voices. Only when Benigsen came into the cottage did Kutuzov stir from his corner and move towards the table, but only so far so that his face would not be lit by the candles that had been placed on it. Benigsen opened the council with the question, to abandon Russia's sacred and ancient capital without a fight, or to defend it? A long and general silence ensued. All faces frowned, and in the silence Kutuzov's angry grunting and coughing could be heard. All eyes looked at him. Malasha also looked at Grandpa. She was closest to him of all and saw how his face winced. It was as if he was about to cry, but that did not last long. Russia's sacred and ancient capital! He suddenly began in an angry voice, repeating Benigsen's words, and thereby indicating the false note in those words. Allow me to tell you, Your Excellency, that this question has no meaning for a Russian. He heaved his heavy body forward. Such a question cannot be posed, and such a question has no meaning. The question for which I have asked these gentlemen to meet is a military one. The question is this. Russia's salvation lies in the army. Is it more advantageous to risk losing the army and Moscow by accepting the battle, or to surrender Moscow without a battle? That is the question on which I would like to know your opinion. He heaved himself back into the armchair. A debate began. Benigsen did not consider the game lost. Allowing for the opinion of Barclay and others about the impossibility of accepting a defensive battle at Fili, he, imbued with Russian patriotism and love for Moscow, suggested shifting the troops during the night from the right flank to the left and striking at the right wing of the French the next day. Opinions were divided. There were arguments for and against this opinion. Ermolov, Doktorov, and Raevsky agreed with Benigsen's opinion. Whether guided by a sense of the need for sacrifice before abandoning the capital, or by other more personal considerations, these generals seemed not to understand that the present council could not change the inevitable course of events, and that Moscow had already been abandoned. The rest of the generals understood that, and leaving aside the question of Moscow, spoke of the direction the army should take in its retreat. Natasha, who looked at what was happening before her without taking her eyes away, understood the meaning of this counsel differently. It seemed to her that it was a matter only of a personal struggle between Grandpa and Longskirts, as she called Bennigsen. She saw that they were angry when they spoke to each other, and in her heart she took Grandpa's side. In the middle of the conversation, she noticed a sly glance that Grandpa cast at Bennigsen, and after that, to her joy, noticed that Grandpa had said something to Longskirts that took him aback. Bennigsen suddenly turned red and angrily paced about the cottage. The words had so affected Bennigsen were Kutuzov's opinion, expressed in a calm and soft voice, on the advantages and disadvantages of Bennigsen's suggestion about shifting the troops during the night from the right flank to the left for an attack on the French right wing. "Gentlemen," said Kutuzov, "I cannot approve of the Count's plan. Shifting troops in close proximity to the enemy is always dangerous, and military history confirms this consideration. Thus, for example," Kutuzov seemed to ponder, searching for an example and looking at Bennigsen with a bright, naive gaze. "Yes, let's talk about the Battle of Friedland, which, as I believe, the Count remembers well, was not entirely successful only because our troops were reformed in much too close proximity to the enemy." A moment's silence ensued, which seemed very long to all of them. The debate began again, but there were frequent pauses, and the feeling was that there was not much more to talk about. During one such pause, Kutuzov sighed deeply, as if he were about to speak. They all turned to look at him. "Eh bien, messieurs, j'avoue que c'est moi qui paierai les pots cassés." "Well, gentlemen, I see it's I who have to pay for the broken crockery," he said, and slowly getting up, he went to the table. "Gentlemen, I have heard your opinions. Some will disagree with me, but he stopped. "By the power entrusted in me by the sovereign and the fatherland, I order a retreat." After that, the generals began to disperse with the same solemn and silent discretion as people dispersing after a funeral. Some of the generals, in low voices, in quite a different register than when they were speaking at the council, conveyed something to the commander-in-chief. Natasha, who had long been expected at supper, carefully climbed down backwards from her stove shelf, resting her bare little feet on the ledges of the stove, and getting tangled between the legs of the generals, darted through the door. Having dismissed the generals, Kutuzov sat for a long time, his elbow leaning on the table, and thought about the same terrible question. When was it decided finally to abandon Moscow? When was the thing done that decided this question? Who was to blame for it? This I didn't expect," he said to the adjutant Schneider, who had come into the room when it was already late at night. "This I didn't expect. This never occurred to me." "You must get some rest, your serenity," said Schneider. "But no! They'll eat horse flesh like the Turks," Kutuzov shouted, without replying, banging the table with his plump hand. "That they will, if only." Section 5. In contrast to Kutuzov, at the same time, in an event still more important than the army's retreat without a battle, in the abandoning and burning of Moscow, Rostopchin, who we picture as the guiding hand of this event, acted quite differently. This event, the abandoning and burning of Moscow, was as inevitable as the army's retreat beyond Moscow without a battle after the Battle of Borodino. Every Russian, not on the basis of reasoning, but on the basis of the feeling that is inside us and was inside our fathers, could have predicted what was to take place. Beginning with Smolensk, the same thing that happened in Moscow had been happening in all the towns and villages on Russian soil, without the participation of Rostopchin in his posters. People nonchalantly awaited the enemy, did not riot, did not fret, did not tear anyone to pieces, but calmly awaited their fate, feeling themselves strong enough to find, at the most difficult moment, what needed to be done. And as soon as the enemy approached, the wealthiest elements of the population left, abandoning their property, the poor stayed, and set fire to and destroyed what remained. The consciousness that it would be so and always would be so lies in the soul of every Russian. And that consciousness, and what is more, the foreboding that Moscow would be taken, lay in Russian Moscow society in the year 12. Those who stayed, those who started leaving Moscow already in July and the beginning of August showed that they expected it, and those who left, taking along whatever they could, abandoning houses and half their property, acted that way because of the hidden, latent patriotism of which is expressed not in phrases, not in the killing of children to save the fatherland, and similar unnatural acts, but inconspicuously, simply, organically, and therefore always produces the strongest results. It is shameful to flee from danger. Only cowards are fleeing Moscow, they were told. Rostopchin, in his little posters, kept instilling in them that to leave Moscow was disgraceful. People were ashamed to be called cowards, were ashamed to go, but all the same they went, knowing that it had to be so. Why did they go? It is impossible to suppose that Rostopchin had frightened them with the horrors Napoleon had committed in conquered lands. The first to leave were the rich, educated people who knew very well that Vienna and Berlin remained intact, and that there, during Napoleon's occupation, the citizens passed the time gaily with the charming Frenchmen whom the Russians, and especially the ladies, liked so much then. They went because, for Russians, there could be no question of whether it would be good or bad under French rule in Moscow. To be under French rule was impossible. It was the worst thing of all. They were leaving before the Battle of Borodino, and still more quickly after the Battle of Borodino, despite the call to defense, despite the announcements by Moscow's commander-in-chief of his intention to take up the Iverskaya icon and go to fight, and the hot air balloons that were to destroy the French, and despite all the nonsense Rostopchin wrote in his posters. They knew it was for the army to fight, and that it could not, and that if it could not, it was impossible to go to the Three Hills with young ladies and servants to fight Napoleon, and they had to leave, however sorry they were to abandon their property to destruction. They were leaving without thinking of the majestic significance of that huge, wealthy capital being abandoned by its inhabitants, and obviously burned. A large wooden city was bound to be burned. Each was leaving for his own sake, and at the same time it was only because they left that the majestic event took place which shall forever remain the finest glory of the Russian people. The lady who, in the month of June, was already moving out of Moscow to her estate near Saratov, with her blackamoors and women gestures, with a vague awareness that she was not a servant to Bonaparte, and fearing she might be stopped by an order from Count Rostopchin, was performing, simply and genuinely, the great deed which saved Russia. But Count Rostopchin, who now shamed those who were leaving, now evacuated government offices, now distributed good-for-nothing weapons among the drunken riffraff, took up icons, now forbade Augustin to evacuate relics and icons, now confiscated all private carts, now transported the hot air balloon constructed by Lipich on 136 carts, now hinted that he would burn Moscow, now told how he had burned his own house, and wrote a proclamation to the French in which he solemnly reproached them for destroying his orphanage. Now he assumed the glory of having burned Moscow. Now he renounced it. Now he ordered the people to catch all the spies and bring them to him. Now he reproached the people for it. Now he banished all the French from Moscow. Now he allowed Madame Aubert-Chalmé, the center of all the French population of Moscow, to remain in the city, and ordered the old and venerable postmaster General Kailucharev, who had done nothing particularly wrong, to be arrested and exiled. Now he gathered the people on the Three Hills to fight the French. Now, in order to be rid of those same people, he turned them loose to murder a man and escaped through the back gate himself. Now he said he would not survive the misfortune of Moscow. Now he wrote French verses in an album with his part in the affair. This man did not understand the meaning of the event that was taking place, but only wanted to do something himself, to astonish someone or other, to accomplish something patriotically heroic, and like a boy frolicked about over the majestic and inevitable event of the abandoning and burning of Moscow, and tried with his little hand now to encourage, now to stem the flow of the enormous current of people which carried him along with it. Section 6. Helene, having returned with the Count from Vilno to Petersburg, found herself in a difficult situation. In Petersburg, Helene enjoyed the special patronage of a dignitary who occupied one of the highest posts in state. In Vilno, she had come close she had become close with a young foreign prince. When she returned to Petersburg, both the prince and the dignitary were there. Both claimed their rights, and Helene was faced with a new task in her career, to maintain her close relations with them both without offending either. What would have seemed difficult and even impossible for another woman never once made Countess Bezukov stop and think. Clearly, it was not in vain that she enjoyed the reputation of a most intelligent woman. If she had begun to conceal her actions, to extricate herself by cunning from an awkward situation, she would thereby have spoiled things for herself, acknowledging herself guilty. But Helene, on the contrary, like a truly great person who can do whatever she likes, at once placed herself in the position of being right, in which she sincerely believed, and all others in the position of being wrong. The first time the young foreign person allowed himself to reproach her, she proudly raised her beautiful head and half turning to him, said firmly, "Voilà l'égoïsme et la crainte des hommes. Je ne m'attendais pas à autre chose. La femme se sacrifice pour vous. Elle souffre, et voilà sa récompense. Quel droit avez-vous, monseigneur, de me demander compte de mes amitiés, de mes affections? C'est son homme qui est plus qu'un père pour moi." There you have the egoism and cruelty of men. I expected nothing else. A woman sacrifices herself for you. She suffers, and there is her reward. What right you have, my lord, to ask me to account for my friendship, for my affections? He is a man who has been more than a father to me. The person wanted to say something. Helene interrupted him. "Eh bien oui," she said. "Peut-être que pour moi autres sentiments que ceux d'un père, mais ce n'est pas une raison pour que je dois fermer ma porte. Je ne suis pas un homme pour être ingrate. Sachez, monseigneur, pour tout ce qui a rapport à mes sentiments intimes, je ne rends à compte de que est dû in ma conscience." Well, yes, perhaps he has other feelings for me than those of a father, but that is no reason for me to close my door to him. I'm not a man that I should be ungrateful. No, my lord, that for all that concerns my intimate feelings, I give my accounting only to God and my conscience. She concluded, touching her high, beautiful breasts with her hand and glancing up to the sky. Mais écoutez-moi, en nom de Dieu. Espacez-moi, et je serai votre esclave. Mais c'est impossible. Vous ne daignez pas descendre jusqu'à moi, vous, said Helene, bursting into tears. The person began to comfort her. Helene said through her tears, as if forgetting herself, that nothing could prevent her from marrying, that there were examples. There were still few examples then, but she named Napoleon and other highly placed persons, that she had never been a wife to her husband, that she had been sacrificed. But laws, religion, said the person, already yielding. Laws, religion. Why would they have been invented if they couldn't do that? Said Helene. The important person was astonished that such a simple argument could have failed to occur to him, and turned for advice to the holy brothers of the Society of Jesus, with whom he was in close relations. Several days later, at one of the enchanting fetes given by Helene at her summer house on the Kameni Island, the enchanting Monsieur de Joubert was introduced to her, a man no longer young, with now snow-white hair and shining black eyes, un Jesuite à robe courte, who had a long conversation with Helene in the light of the garden illuminations and to the sound of music about the love of God, of Christ, of the heart of the Mother of God, and about the comforts provided in this life and the next by the one true Catholic religion. Helene was moved. And several times, both she and Monsieur de Joubert, with tears in their eyes and a tremor in their voices, had tears in their eyes and a tremor in their voices. A dance to which a partner came to invite Helene disrupted her conversation with her future directeur de conscience. But the next day, Monsieur Joubert came alone in the evening to see Helene, and after that began to frequent her. One day he took the Countess to the Catholic Church, where she knelt before the altar she had been brought to. The enchanting, not too young Frenchman took his hand on her head, and as she herself recounted later, she felt something like a breath of fresh wind descend into her soul. It was explained to her that this was la Grâce. Then an abbé à robe longue was brought to her, and he confessed her and gave her absolution of her sins. The next day, a box with communion in it was brought to her and left for home use. A few days later, Helene, to her satisfaction, learned that she now had joined the true Catholic Church, and that one of these days the Pope himself would learn of her and send her some document. All that was happening around her and to her at this time, all this attention paid to her by so many intelligent people, and expressed in such pleasant, refined forms, and the dove-like purity in which she now found herself. She wore white dresses with white ribbons all the time. All this afforded her pleasure, but never for a moment did she lose sight of her goal beyond that pleasure. And as it always happens in matters of cunning that a stupid person tricks the more intelligent, she, having realized that the goal of all this talk and fuss consisted primarily in converting her to Catholicism in order to take money from her for the benefit of Jesuit institutions, of which they had given her hints, Helene, before giving money, insisted that various operations be performed over her that would free her from her husband. To her mind, the meaning of any religion consisted only in observing certain decencies while satisfying human desires. And with that purpose, in one of her talks with her spiritual director, she insistently demanded an answer to the question of the extent to which her marriage bound her. They were sitting in the drawing room by the window. It was twilight. Through the window came the scent of flowers. Helene was wearing a white dress, transparent on the shoulders and the breast. The abbé, a well-fed man with a plump, clean-shaven chin and a pleasant, firm mouth and white hands folded meekly on his knees, sat close to Helene, and with a subtle smile on his lips, looked at her face now and then with a glance peacefully admiring of her beauty, and expounded his view of the question that concerned them. Helene, smiling uneasily, looked at his wavy hair, clean-shaven, plump, bluish cheeks, and expected the conversation to take a new turn any moment. But the abbé, though obviously enjoying the beauty and closeness of his interlocutress, was carried away by his mastery of the case. The course of the spiritual director's reasoning was as follows. In ignorance of the meaning of what you were undertaking, you gave a vow of marital fidelity to a man who, for his part, having entered into marriage without believing in its religious meaning, has committed blasphemy. This marriage did not have the double meaning it should have had, but despite that, you were bound by your vow. You departed from it. What did you commit in doing so? A péché venial or a péché mortel? A péché venial because you committed your act without bad intent. You now entered into a new marriage with the purpose of having children. If you now entered into a new marriage with the purpose of having children, your sin could be forgiven. But again, the question falls into two parts. First, but I think, said the suddenly bored Helene with her enchanting smile, that having embraced the true religion, I cannot be bound by what a false religion imposed on me. The directeur de conscience was astonished by this Columbus's egg that stood directly before him with such simplicity. He was delighted with the unexpected quick success of his pupil, but could not renounce the edifice of arguments he had erected with such mental labor. Attendons nos, comtesse, he said with a smile, and began to refute the reasoning with his spiritual daughter. Section 7. Helene realized that the case was very simple and easy from the point of view of spiritual direction, but that her directors made difficulties only because they had apprehensions about how the secular authorities would look at it. As a result, Helene decided that the case had to be prepared for in society. She provoked the jealousy of the old dignitary and told him the same thing as the first suitor, that is, put things so that the only way to obtain rights over her was to marry her. The old important person was as struck for the first moment by this proposal to marry her while her husband was living as the first young person had been. But Helene's unshakable conviction that this was as simple and natural as a young girl getting married had its effect on him too. If even the slightest signs of hesitation, shame, or secretiveness had been noticed in Helene herself, her case would undoubtedly have been lost. But not only were there no signs of secretiveness or shame, but on the contrary, With simplicity and good-natured naivete, she told her close friends, and that meant all of Petersburg, that both the prince and the dignitary had proposed to her, and that she loved them both and was afraid to upset either of them. The rumor instantly spread through Petersburg, not that Helene wanted to divorce her husband. If such a rumor had spread, a great many people would have risen up against such an unlawful intention, but simply that the unfortunate, interesting Helene was in the perplexity about which of the two men to marry. The question now consisted not in the degree to which this was possible, but only in which match was the more advantageous and how the court would look at it. There were indeed some obdurate people who were unable to raise to the height of the question and saw in this project a profanation of the sacrament of marriage, but they were few, and they kept quiet, while the majority were interested in the question of the happiness that had befallen Helene and which choice was better. As for whether it was good or bad to marry while one's husband was living, no one spoke of it, because this question had obviously already been decided by people more intelligent than you and I, as they said, and to doubt the correctness of the decision would mean to risk showing one's stupidity and inability to live in society. Only Marya Dmitrievna Akhorosimov, who came to Petersburg that summer to meet one of her sons, allowed herself to openly express her opinion, which ran counter to that of society. Meeting Helene at a ball, Marya Dmitrievna stopped her in the middle of the ballroom and amidst the general silence said to her in her gruff voice, "So here you've started this marrying while your husband's still living. Maybe you think you've invented some novelty. You've been forestalled, dearie. It was invented long ago. They do it and with those words, Marya Dmitrievna, with a habitual threatening gesture, pushed up her wide sleeves and looked around sternly, strode through the room. Marya Dmitrievna, though feared, was looked upon in Petersburg as a jester, and therefore, of the words she had spoken, only the crude word was noticed and repeated among them in a whisper, supposing that the one word contained all of the salt of what she had said. Prince Vasily, who forgot what he said especially often of late, and repeated the same thing 100 times, said each time he happened to see his daughter, "Hélène, j'ai un mot à vous dire," he said, taking her aside and pulling her hand down. "J'ai eu vent de certains projets relatifs à... Vous savez, eh bien, ma chère enfant, vous savez que mon corps de père se réjouit de vous savoir. Vous savez tant se faire, mes chéris enfants. Ne consultez que votre corps. C'est tout ce que je vous dis. Helene, I have a word for you. I've got wind of certain plans concerning you know. Well, my dear child, you know that my father's heart rejoices to know that you've suffered so. But, my dear child, consult only your own heart. That's what I have to say to you." And, concealing ever the same emotion, he pressed his cheek to his daughter's cheek and walked away. Bilibin, who had not lost his reputation as the most intelligent man, and who was Helene's distinguished friend, was one of those friends that brilliant women always have, male friends who can never pass into the category of lovers. Bilibin, once in a small petit comité, voiced his view of this matter to his friend Helene. "Écoutez, Bilibin," Helene always called such friends as Bilibin by their last name. She touched the sleeve of his tailcoat with her white, beringed hand. "Dites-moi comme vous diriez un sœur que douce faire, lequel de deux?" Listen, Bilibin, tell me as you would a sister. What must I do? Which of the two? Bilibin gathered the skin over his eyebrows and with a smile on his lips fell to thinking. "You're not catching me unawares, you know. As a true friend, I have thought and rethought about your affair. Look, if you marry the prince," this was the young man. He unbent one finger. "Look, if you marry the prince," this was the young man, "you lose forever the chance to marry the other one, and then, too, you displease the court. As you know, there's some sort of a relation. But if you marry the old count, you make for the happiness of his last days, and then, as the dignitary's widow, the prince will no longer be marrying beneath him by marrying you," he said, and he released the skin. "Voilà un véritable ami," said Helene, brightening up and touching Bilibin's sleeve once again. "Mais c'est que jamais l'un et l'autre. Je ne voudrais pas le leur faire de chagrin. Je donnerai ma vie pour le bonheur à tous deux, she said. That's a true friend, but the thing is that I love them both. I wouldn't want to grieve them. I'd give my life for the happiness of them both. Bilibin shrugged his shoulders, showing that even he could do nothing about such a plight. A masterful woman. That's what is known as putting the question squarely. She'd like to marry all three of them at once, thought Bilibin. But tell me, how will your husband look at the matter, he said, his reputation being so firmly founded that he would not be afraid of harming himself by such a naive question. Will he consent? Ah, he loves me so, said Helene, who for some reason fancied that Pierre also loved her. He'll do anything for me. Bilibin gathered the skin to indicate that a malt was in preparation. Même le divorce, he said. Helen laughed. Among the people who allowed themselves to doubt the lawfulness of the projected marriage was Helene's mother, Princess Kuragin. She was constantly tormented by the envy of her daughter, and now, when the subject of envy was closest to the princess's heart, she could not reconcile herself to this thought. She consulted with a Russian priest about the extent to which it was possible to divorce and enter into marriage while the husband was living, and the priest told her it was impossible, and, to her joy, pointed out to her a gospel text which, as it seemed to the priest, rejected outright the possibility of entering into marriage while the husband is living. Armed with these arguments, which to her seemed irrefutable, the princess went to her daughter early one morning so as to find her alone. Having heard her mother's objections, Helene smiled meekly and mockingly. But it says straight out, whoever marries a divorced woman, said the old princess. Ah, Mama, don't say stupid things. You don't understand anything. In my position, I have duties. Helene began, switching to French from Russian, in which it always seemed to her that there was some lack of clarity in her case. But my friend. Ah, Mamma, how is it you don't understand that the Holy Father, who has the right to grant dispensations. Just then, a lady companion who lived at Helene's came to report that His Highness was in the reception room and wishing to see her. No, tell him that I don't want to see him, that I'm furious with him, because he didn't keep his word to me. Comtesse, as-tu péché miséricorde? Countess, for every sin there is a mercy, said a fair-haired young man with a long face and nose coming in. The old princess respectfully rose and curtsied. The young man paid no attention to her. The princess nodded to her daughter and sailed towards the door. No, she's right, thought the old princess, all of whose convictions crumbled before the appearance of His Highness. She's right, but how is it we didn't know it in our long-lost youth? Yet it was so simple, thought the old princess, getting into her carriage. At the beginning of August, Helene's case became perfectly defined, and she wrote a letter to her husband, who loved her very much, as she thought, in which she informed him of her intention to marry N.N., and of the fact that she had embraced the one true religion and that she asked him to go through all the necessary formalities of divorce, of which the bearer of the letter would inform him. Sur ce j'ai prédit, mon ami, je vous avoir sous ce sein et poussant garde votre amie Hélène, upon which I pray God, my friend, to keep you under his holy and powerful protection, your friend Hélène. This letter was brought to Pierre's house at the time when he was on the field of Borodino. Well, we'll have to stop it there, but we did do a good chunk, and thank you all for bearing with me. That was a meaty and not entirely easily comprehensible chunk. He, apart from being a polyglot and throwing as many languages into this book as possible, he really does dig into some of these deep, philosophical questions. And I love the way he makes them sometimes very scientific and sometimes very anecdotal, which I think he maybe borrows that sort of way of bouncing back and forth from different ways of describing things from the one character earlier on who was the advisor to the emperor, and how he talked about how he would bounce back and forth between different ways of making his argument. But Tolstoy seems to be doing much the same thing, and some of his arguments are quite very specifically and methodically worded, rather difficult. It's kind of have to really dig into it and to really get to the meaning of what he's getting at. But definitely a lot of interesting observations about the way we approach history and the way we ascribe, I don't want to say blame, but responsibility for actions and the outcome of things. And also the interesting turn of events with Helen. She is always been a rather interesting character to me, because I can't help but wondering, as a woman, what she would think of herself, or, indeed, if she were to write about her actions, maybe honestly, like in her own diary. Because clearly there's some level of a level of intrigue, and he calls this cunning, and it does appear, and definitely the way he's written it, that she does seem to be a rather scheming person, and he calls her, quite a simple, stupid person in a way. And she does seem to be rather very base in her, ways of approaching her life. But all the same, she does seem to get things done. So just rather interesting. And rather interesting that, after all that, now she's going to divorce Pierre and marry someone else. And I wonder what that will mean for Pierre and for his estates, because he was, one of the wealthiest people in Russian society at the time. So I wonder if, with her divorcing him, if she's going to try to, because I think he gave her a bunch of his estates, or said he was going to, because he had wanted to divorce her, a ways back or something, just because of some of her actions. But yeah, rather interesting, I suppose. We'll see. And of course, it's like a Dear John letter. This letter comes to his house while he's off, walking around the battlefield of Borodino. Like the original Dear John letter is really a Dear Pierre letter. So it's interesting. But thank you guys for joining in. Hope you're having a great Wednesday. We will dig into more Tolstoy tomorrow. And like I said, we're going to see if we can really plug through and, keep these readings a little longer, so we can hopefully get through more a little bit faster. So thank you all. Have a great day. And like I said, I'll put the links to where you can donate if you want to help with the humanitarian help supply aid during this crisis in Lebanon. So thank you all very much. Have a great day. Stay safe. Stay sane.